Yeah, I even checked because I wanted to see how it converted and such things. So did you check? Oh, wow. This is I should. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, they get one who doesn't come here. Was that in her community? There's lots of moving parts. They can be a place to live with. Video camera, which is why if you thought you were here, all of a sudden you're done. Okay, let's go ahead and get started for our second panel on geographies of power. So you're welcome to keep eating, but let's try to keep it down so that our presenters, so we can hear our presenters. We have up here Abby Templer, who is in Brazil. She's going to be Skyping in for her presentation, so I'll go ahead and introduce everyone. Abby is a PhD student in the sociology department. Her research interests include economic sociology, social change, sociology of knowledge, social inequality, and research methods. She's working on her dissertation examining diverse economic practices that support the work of artists in Western Massachusetts and the values that motivate their art. And then we'll have Sarah Miller. Sarah is also a PhD candidate in sociology and holds an MA in women's studies from San Francisco State. Sarah's research focuses on youth, gender, sexuality, and social inequality. Her ethnographic work explores the ecology of bullying, investigating relationships between schools, families, gender and culture, and youth aggression. And before coming to graduate school, Sarah directed a sexual violence prevention program in Chicago. And then we'll have Candan Turkan, who is originally from Istanbul. Candan is a PhD student in political science. She holds 2 MA degrees in political theory from NYU and NSSR. What is NSSR? School for Social Research. And she's working on a project on food and power. In her free time, she recreates, what kind of recipes? Medieval recipes. Learns Japanese and writes about food depictions in movies. And she hopes to get her PhD in political theories, but she wonders what that will get her in the future. Thank you for sharing that, Jen. I think a lot of people knew that. And then finally, Chris Smith is a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology. Her research interests include crime and delinquency, feminist criminology, social network analysis, and historical methods. Her dissertation received funding from the National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Justice. And then we have 2 discussants. Victoria Rizzo-Lenshin is a PhD candidate in German, and again, she was one of our completing certificate students last year. She's in film studies and has returned from an extended research visit in Berlin, which was supported by a DAAD, I don't know what that is, research grant.
German Academic Exchange.
Okay. She has published articles on East German cinema, most recently as a contributor to the 2nd volume of the Directory of World Cinema, and forthcoming co-authored article on Horg Foss 1988 East German Vietnamese co-production Time in the Jungle. And then our other discussant is Whitney Battle-Baptiste, assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology, although Whitney just got her tenure letter. Not quite completely official, but 99.9% there. And Whitney is a historical archaeologist interested in race, gender, and cultural landscapes. Her theoretical interests include Black feminist theory, critical race theory, the African diaspora, and critical heritage studies. Her publications include commentaries and papers on historical archaeology and slavery in the southern United States. She's conducted field work at the Andrew Jackson home in Nashville, the Rickneck Plantation in Williamsburg, and the Abel Smith School in Boston, as well as the W.E.B. Du Bois home site in Great Barrington. Her latest research is on the Miller's Plantation on the island of Eleuthera in the Bahamas, and she is the author of Black Feminist Archaeology. She wrote the book on Black Feminist Archaeology and published in 2011. Okay, so I'll give you time over here, and we'll go in that order. Okay, so Abby, you're up.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I cannot see you, but I hope you can see me. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. Oh, hey, that's great. Hi.
Oh, that's good. Oh, no.
That's a great moment.
I know time.
Okay.
You're good.
All right, you saw everyone. That's all you get.
Oh, no.
There you go.
Are we?
Yep, we can hear
Go
you.
ahead. No, but she's frozen. Is the table-
All right. In the fall of 2010, I conducted participatory action research with artists and artisans in the greater Franklin County to learn about their economic practices. Home to 23 of the 27 forest towns in the Commonwealth and home of the highest concentration of artists and artisans in the state, Franklin County has a lot of artists and artisans living on the economic fringes. It's a region described as economically depressed. So I co-coordinated this project with Leo Huang, who is a graduate student in the Department of Geography. So this was an interdisciplinary dissertation project, basically. We hired 22 artists and artisans to work with us as a research team. Members of the research team were paid to receive training on research ethics and practices. They then interviewed 5 peers and participated in a collaborative analysis at the conclusion of the interviews. So this research method left us with 131 interviews with artists and artisans about their economic practices and the values that motivate their work. So only 3 months passed from the time of initial training to the conclusion of interviewing. This was a very intense data collection period. But in the 5 months that followed, team members collaborated to present their findings at a local creative economy summit. They compiled a chapbook of favorite interview themes, and we hosted an art show that showcased the art of the members of the research team. So all in all, it was from September 2010 to May of 2011 that we accomplished a great number of things, and arguably too many things, because we kind of experienced burnout at the end of this. So this is the point at which the project wound down. The grant money came to an end. We experienced burnout. Some of the members and the co-coordinators experienced burnout. 3 members of the research team moved away, and 1 member of the team unexpectedly passed away. So we had some pretty big changes by the end of the project. So 2 years later, in April 2013, I attended the Lift Your Spirits Gospel concert at the Second Congregational Church in Greenfield. This was a joyous, raucous show organized by 2 members of the research team, a husband and wife duo, Morning Star and Moonlight. Moonlight was the lead vocalist, accompanied by Morning Star, and they featured a world-renowned yet locally oriented jazz saxophone player. The acoustics were wonderful in the sanctuary, and Moonlight sang in the pew to increase the connection with the audience. So midway through the performance, while he's out in the pews doing his thing, he hugs a woman, and it's Jean. She's another woman from the research team. So after the show, I went up and talked to her, to see how she was doing. And it turns out that her husband was the retired minister of the church in which this concert was being held. So she actually provided the venue for Morning Star and Moonlight to perform. And it turned out that this was the second time she'd invited them to this church. While she and I are talking, Moonlight comes over, and with her arms wide, Jean says, "Next time we're going to fill this church, Moonlight." And I'm excited to say that next time was 3 weeks ago. They had this concert again, so it's becoming an annual event. So after the show, it hit me, okay, the project wound down 2 years ago, but members of the research team are continuing to work together. And they're supporting each other economically. So the admission to this concert was $15. So by providing the congregation, by providing an audience, the congregation, and the venue, the church, Jean was directly supporting other members of the research team economically. And it also turns out that the guest saxophone player was somebody who Moonlight had met through the interviews. He was one of Moonlight's interviewees. So we see that 2 years after the research project ended, the on-the-ground effects were still continuing. So this led me to 2 research questions. First, sociological knowledge production aside, what are the on-the-ground effects of this research process? What was produced? And second, what are the mechanisms through which this production happened? So to answer these questions, I first need to identify theoretical frameworks that argue that science is productive, meaning it produces the world rather than merely describing the world. Foucault, feminism, actor network theory, these are the 3 theories that I drew on. And I specifically used Foucault's concept of micropower as used by Dawn Moon. Moon explores the way in which the productive power of everyday interactions forecloses particular ways of being. She looked at the way in which interaction foreclosed particular forms of subjects. In my research, I look at the way in which interactions open opportunities for new forms of subjectivities. So we're looking at slightly different things through the use of micropower. So specifically, I was interested in what it was about these interactions that occurred within the research process that created these lasting effects. So let me tell you more about the research process. We modeled our research after the participatory action research projects of Cameron and Gibson and the Creative Economies Collective. This is a research design which fuses a discursive disruption with peer-to-peer interviewing, with the aim of opening a space for the emergence of new economic subjectivities. In our research, we specifically aimed to disrupt the needs-based discourse, which leads to dependent economic subjectivities. It's a discourse that often leads communities to rely exclusively on external help for development rather than seeing their own practices as a source of economic development power. So within this project, thank you, we developed what I call an asset-based stance. It fuses Gibson Graham's reparative stance with asset-based thinking. So in this project, stance is both an emotional and an affective positioning of the self in relationship to knowledge production. A reparative stance is a stance that welcomes surprise, it entertains hope, it makes connections, and it offers care for the new by encouraging a shift in organized habits of feeling and judgment. So first, we created this shift in organized ways of thinking and being through substituting a needs-based thinking with asset-based thinking. And it's important for me to note that asset-based thinking does not mean that needs go away. If you can picture a glass that's half full, you see the water the water are the assets and the empty space at the top is the needs. They coexist. So needs and assets coexist. And we were here to look at what exists. So we were looking for asset-based thinking. Second, the asset-based way of thinking shaped how we looked for possibilities. We were explicitly looking for possibilities that emerged in terms of community and individual assets. These were what emerged during the research process. So this meant that artists were more open to seeing themselves and their peers as capable economic actors, shifting the way in which they related to the economy and increasing the likelihood for material outcomes to emerge. So within this opening, what was produced?
I observed two main categories of change. The first is an internal individual change, including a shift in subjectivity. And the second major category are material outcomes. So I'm going to start with subjectivity. For Don, one member of the research team, it opened a way of seeing himself that had been socialized out of him at a very early age. I found that part of me that probably got squashed with his volume lowering here, the expectation of going into something like engineering or whatever, from my family and the education I had. Here his voice is so low, he's barely audible. What he's sharing is so painful. I always knew it was there, the artistic creativity, and boy, hanging out with people who do this, it's wow. This is some life-altering work. Thank you. Through interactions with his peers, Don was valued as a creative person with capacity and potential, leading him to create his first piece of visual art. He's not a visual artist, but he took on the challenge for this project. He was deeply proud of the piece that he created and the process, being encouraged to trying, and then being well received, turned out to be life-altering for Don. This process allowed his creativity, which as his voice betrayed, had been painfully crushed in his early life, to reemerge late again in life. He's in his late 60s, early 70s. And the following year, he and his wife, Judy, also a member of the research team, organized an art show which was on display at the Massachusetts State House. And Judy shared with me that it was Don's awakening through the research process that led them to organize this show. Judy was already a self-aware artist, and this new awakening in Don allowed them to collaborate artistically to put on this art show. They were featuring the work of other artists. Okay, and then here's Robin discussing his participation in the art show. This was wonderful for me. Actually, every year I set goals for myself. And one of my goals for this year was to get my artwork printed out. And lo and behold, this opportunity, the art show, comes along. And now I have 3 pieces on display. It was really exciting for me to be able to exhibit. And I was afraid. I had fear about doing this. I mean, oh my God, it's not good enough. And then everybody says, oh, wow, Robin, it's good. So it was really nice to get those strokes. So concretely, the research process provided an opportunity for him to show his work, and the essay-based stance provided a safe environment for Robin, a performing artist, to display his visual work for the first time. And it led him to feel comfortable enough that he has shown his work again, including in the art show that Don and Judy organized. So we see a link here between changes in subjectivity and material outcomes. Other material outcomes include housing. One member of the research team found affordable housing through the interview process. Numerous artistic collaborations were started, 3 of which are still continuing today. There was a transfer of practical skills and knowledge about what it means to be an artist in this particular community, and it deepened existing relationships. People interviewed their colleagues and friends, and it changed the way they relate to each other. So the mechanisms for change that we see emerging here is repeated peer-to-peer interaction conducted through an asset-based stance. So in conclusion, research is productive. It has on-the-ground effects such that the research process itself becomes a site for social change. My findings suggest that repeated peer-to-peer interaction framed through an asset-based stance increase the effects of research process on members of the research team. This model is particularly useful in the creative economy because it tends to be a sector open to new ideas, while it's also a sector through which gentrifying development practices enter into communities. The Richard Florida Creative Cities development strategy is very popular right now, and if you haven't yet heard about it, you will. It's big. So this is a way of intervening into that. In the context of Franklin County, it was important because the needs-based discourse is so strong, increasing the dependence on external gentrifying development practices. So by disrupting that discourse within a network of peers creates a space in which those peers can create new economic possibilities together. Thank you.
Abby, I don't know if we can leave you up here while we're doing the PowerPoint.
We can let her listen.
Okay, you can listen in, but you won't be up on the screen. So.
Yeah, I would like to listen and not be on screen.
I guess she would have to be on the screen.
Yeah, You're just there in the corner, so don't pick your nose or anything. Pick your nose, Abby.
Well, you can just leave the frame. Because they're gonna be using.
Oh, but she can move over
Yeah.
out of the frame.
Oh.
Out of direct view. And then she was up.
But I don't know. No? Kind of, no, I think we should. Or, let's try.
I think you can minimize her so she can hear.
Yeah, what if I turn off the video?
Yeah.
Wait, no, I see you. That doesn't work.
Thanks, Abby.
Oh, yours.
Okay.
I'm gonna mute myself, okay?
Sorry, guys.
Using.
There we go.
Good? Okay. Okay, so hi everyone. Thanks for organizing this fantastic conference. All right. So, between 2008 and 2013, the national media covered the suicides of 13 adolescent girls who each took their lives after rumors and gossip spread about their sexualities. Though there are a variety of contributing factors in the months prior to their deaths, these young women were subjects of sexual rumors, homophobic taunts, or were labeled sluts, whores, or lesbians, mainly by other girls. In combination with increasing national attention on cyberbullying and bullycides among boys, these deaths have placed slut-shaming and homophobia at the forefront of national concerns about bullying, as well as at the center of debates about its criminalization, specifically Phoebe Prince's death. While few young women take their lives following what is often framed in popular culture as mean girls conflict, quite problematically, their stories reveal how talk about the interlaced boundaries of femininity and sexuality remain a prominent and dangerous cultural tool in the gendering processes of adolescence. So this paper explores one element of this phenomenon, sexual rumor, which is a commonly used bullying tactic between girls. Like vague discourse among boys, which a lot of us have heard about, especially in sociology, rumor spreading and gossip about other girls' sexual actions and orientations are vehicles for both girls' bullying practices and gendering processes. However, we currently know little about how girls make sense of this social phenomenon, nor how cultural meanings embedded in bullying practices translate into early adulthood. So I'm exploring how sexual rumors contribute to the construction and negotiation of whatever normative femininity means in late adolescence. I find that given many of the constraints on adolescent sexuality, and particularly on girls' sexuality in the United States, this form of bullying is better understood as a resource rather than a pathological behavior. So, what we know about bullying. Fundamentally, we know that bullying is about status and about negotiating and jockeying for status within high school and junior high school spaces. We now know it also has to do with policing sexuality and gender norms. But a lot of scholars, especially now, are starting to have us look at the broader picture here. That this is not about individual psychology, but about the social context in which bullying takes place. And it's also not about the province of youth, and we shouldn't be thinking about this as the province of youth, but about the larger structural inequalities that exist among youth and among adults. What's going on within bullying and bullying discourses is very much about what adults create. This is the world adults have created for them. And so I take that kind of a framework looking at this study. By no means am I trying to blame girls for what they're doing to each other. What we know now is that bullying is both a gendering practice as well as a gendering process, right? In terms of being a gendered practice, by no means are these completely ideal types. There's plenty of research out there that talks about how boys do bully in indirect ways and girls do bully in direct ways, and this is also classed and raced. But mainly what we know is that it does happen in somewhat different ways. Boys are more direct about their bullying practices. Girls are slightly more indirect about their bullying practices. Boys are understood as being much more physical, more name callings. The fag discourse stuff is where that is coming into place. Whereas girls are more relational, they're more into spreading rumors and gossip, isolating themselves from others, that kind of stuff. Or what they call drama, which is their way of resisting the bullying narrative that adults place on them. In addition, what is going on here is this is happening primarily in same-sex groups as well. So this is something that is happening among boys and among girls. Certainly it happens between as well, but a lot of it is happening within same-sex peer groups. And if you look at the content of what is going on, a lot of it has to do with gender and policing gender norms. And so I'm really interested in what's going on with that. And if you actually look at the content, a lot of it is also about sexuality. But we have a long history in sociology, at least, about rumor spreading and gossip and its many pro-social functions, right? Oh, sorry, Abby, I think we lost her. So we have, all this research out there that talks about how gossip and rumor absolutely is about connecting and strengthening group bonds. It's a way for somebody to project a positive self-image by discrediting somebody else's. It's a way of reinforcing and making sense of group norms and establishing moral standards, right? So these are all different functions that rumor has that actually does produce things for people. But for teens today, rumors and gossip are spreading much more frequently in what we call network publics, right? In social media spaces, which makes rumors much more persistent, more searchable, replicable, and widely available to an enormous amount of audiences that often are invisible, right? So if you are called a slut or a lesbian in high school now, this is going to be accessible to a lot more people, which makes this potentially a lot more threatening, or at least much more powerful for girls to use against each other. So what did I do? I wanted to take a look at not just how this is happening as teenagers, but how people are also carrying what is going on with them as they enter early adulthood. Because by no means do I think that this process is just what's happening with teens, right? So I interviewed a group of 54 women that were 18 to 20 years old. The majority of them were freshmen in college when I interviewed them. I sampled at a variety of different colleges. I sampled at a big university, at two one private liberal arts college that is in an urban space that is often serving first-generation college students. I also interviewed women at two separate community colleges and two separate all-women's colleges. So I have a broad base where I sampled, and this also yielded a broad base of different people's experiences. These folks went to 51 different high schools in the United States and 13 different states. Additionally, what I don't have up here is there's 10 women that are not heterosexual. They don't identify as heterosexual in here. So I have two lesbian women, one woman that identifies as queer, two women that identify as ace or asexual, in addition, we have a broad range of people's experiences. I'm still sampling. I'm still trying to get more folks. So I can't make as many claims about race as I can about class in here, but I have a pretty good class distribution. And I've done my best to try to get as many folks that are not white in the sample, and I'm continuing to sample that way. So what did I find? Lots of different people's experiences here. First of all, everybody had sexual rumors about girls. I was not sampling for people's experiences with bullying per se. I didn't go out and ask for people who had experiences with bullying. I just wanted to talk to people who would be willing to share about their experiences with their female friends. And when I asked them, can you tell me about a rumor that spread in your high school? All of them had a rumor that was sexual. All of them had rumors about girls. In addition, there were rumors that were very standard across all sorts of different social locations. And a full third of the women that I interviewed had sexual rumors spread about them. And when that happened, that often had really problematic outcomes. There were very different ways in which they experienced having this happen to them. A lot of folks ended up losing friendships, dropping out of extracurricular activities, all sorts of different things. And one person even actually dropped out of high school as a result of this. There's an equal distribution about sexual rumors across class. I don't have as broad of a racial sample as of yet to be able to make claims about race here, but certainly across class there's an equal distribution of who were targets. So I'm curious what rumors do for girls, right? Girls talk about this as just girls being girls. And I also want to make a statement here. What I'm talking about in this paper specifically is about their experiences in high school, and that's why I'm referring to them as girls, because they're talking about themselves as girls in high school, but these are absolutely young women that we're talking about. What I'm curious about is what function it actually serves. People wouldn't be as invested in this if it wasn't doing something for them. And I found that there's various different things that rumors do, right? One is they work as social magnets. Sexual rumors work to bond girls and also to repel girls, often through the bonding and repelling process. So to give you some examples of this, some girls talk explicitly about how rumors were a way to actually engage in their social communities, and they felt like they had to take part. So for instance, Casey recalls that her reputation just sucked in high school because she didn't play into the drama with girls. She says, quote, "I refused. To make friends, you had to spread rumors." Likewise, Heidi explains that she took part in rumor spreading because she didn't want to be alienated from other girls. And she tells me that she and other girls spread rumors about girls to prove that, like, well, everyone's being mean, but I'm not. So people think that I'm like this meek little person, so I have to like have a voice as well, so that I can seem like I'm a part, like I belong. Right? So there are different ways in which they're bonding together. In addition, they talk about the underlying aspects context, right? So Tony was somebody who was very severely bullied in high school, and she explicitly talks about how girls were spreading rumors about her to feel like they were all on the same side about something, that they had something to connect about, to feel a part of something. And what she's getting at is these underlying values that are going on in rumors, right? Girls didn't simply bond just through sharing them, but they're bonding over and choosing friendships based on the underlying values that are negotiated and embedded in rumors. So for example, Holly describes how she and her friends would just avoid the targets of rumors, this, quote, slutty girls in their school, because they were, quote, just people you wouldn't like to associate with, just for the fact of how they carried themselves. It's like they didn't care, no self-respect. Holly believes that these attitudes towards other girls' actions were shared and in fact were common ground for connection. And she tells me that her friends have, quote, the same beliefs that I do, like in the ways like, what makes a girl a slut? We kind of think the exact same thing. You know what I mean? We have the same morals and values about ourselves. And I heard this from a lot of different girls, that rumors and hearing the gossip that was going on with rumors absolutely made them not want to be friends with some girls, and also was something that bonded them with their friends. So they also talk a lot about self-respect in all of this as well. And it's understandable that girls are bonding over self-respect because it's something that they supposedly have access to, and it's also a resource when they don't have other resources. And this is something that girls seem to have a lot of engagement with. So underlying all of this, rumors are working to organize the girls' social worlds, specifically in ways not just through the underlying values, not just through the bonding function, but also in terms of responding to rumors. So girls talk explicitly about making friendships and defending their friends in responses to rumor as well, and that's what made their friendships stronger. So that's one piece of it. The second piece is about meaning making, right? And this is meaning making about sexuality and about femininity. This is not just about sexuality. So what's going on with meaning making has to do with this underlying idea that girls aren't necessarily getting this information elsewhere, and so they're creating it together. Also, pointedly, this is a site of rupture. Girls can make change with this. And there are a few examples that I have, but not enough, of spaces where girls actually are troubling this, right? And I think that we could be thinking more about how we can help girls trouble this additionally. But, okay, we've got 1 minute left. I'm just going to skip that altogether and go right to the conclusion. So there's a lot of different things that are in here in terms of finding. Meaning making is one. This is a space for girls to talk about sex in ways where they can't necessarily talk about sexuality more openly. A lot of girls talk about not being able to talk openly about sexuality with their friends. This is a way in which they're proving femininity, which I'll explain. Well, I will not explain more right now. I'll explain more at a different point. So finally, in conclusion, a growing number of scholars suggest that bullying should be conceptualized not as the domain of youth, nor as the outcome of individual pathology, but as the reproduction of broader structural inequalities. These scholars argue for a shift in focus from individual pathology of bullies to the social context in which bullying occurs, interrogating instead the meanings that are produced through bullying processes and accounting for the role that bullying plays in reinforcing cultural norms that reproduce inequality. This framing of bullying directs our attention to the meanings produced through bullying practices, meanings that are frequently about masculinity and femininity, normalcy and deviance. It is these meanings that are particularly harmful to youth and are also what young people carry with them as they enter new social spaces. Further, as Pascoe argues, framing what young people are doing as individualistic, pathological phenomenons blinds us to the way in which bullying often reflects, reproduces, and prepares young people to accept inequalities embedded in larger structural inequalities. So rather than blaming young women, we need to support young women in developing and sharing new narratives about sexuality. As Gary Fine argues, a society where rumors spread is characterized by institutional breakdown. Either institutions are not communicating or they're not believed to be providing accurate, fair, or necessary information. When young women are given limited and contradictory information about sexuality, it's no wonder they aggressively use sexual rumors to make sense of and negotiate its complicated terrain. In lieu of being institutionally and culturally supported in articulating sexual stories that are positive, agentic, or embodied about their sexualities, girls are left to talk about what they're not supposed to do, what they're not supposed to say, what kind of girl they're not supposed to be. Given these constraints, girls' bullying practices are better understood as normative rather than pathological behaviors. In the absence of sexual education that normalizes and educates teens about sexual and gender variation, and in the presence of heteronormative imperatives, institutionalized homophobia in schools, the persistent threat of sexual violence, and reified gender norms that disavow girls' sexual desire while emphasizing their value as sexual objects, it is understandable that young women in particular are invested in this process. Thank you.
Get Abby back up there. She's there. She's there.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about food right after lunch. I hope that's okay. I'm from political science. I'm going to be talking about food. My field sites are all in Istanbul, and I look at primarily at what I call food exchange sites. So anywhere where you're basically giving something and taking food in return, not in cooked form. That's sort of like my base understanding of what constitutes a food exchange site. So no restaurants, no vendors, food carts, nothing like that. Supermarkets, bazaars, delis, bodegas, charcuterie, cheese shops, organic food stores, regional specialty stores, grocery markets. Keep it broad, but nothing cooked. That's sort of my base understanding of what constitutes a food exchange site. So this is the neighborhood of Sanayi, which in Turkish means industrial neighborhood. It used to be an industrial neighborhood, part of the Kağıthane municipality. I can talk more about that, but that's basically a conservative, religious conservative, lower income neighborhood in Istanbul. This is the main road that goes all the way, this is the European side by the way, all the way from north to south, where you would know the Topkapı Palace is, basically, so that's the geography. North is Black Sea, south is Marmara, all the way down to Mediterranean. So that's the geography. This is the main road, and when I was a kid, this was all mud and factories. My mom, when she was very young, she actually worked in these factories as a chemical engineer. They were eventually transformed. Now all of this is residential, and it used to be like a really bad shanty town that you wouldn't really want to go. But now all of this is changing, starting from this region. They're all plazas, and if you go slightly bit south, this is a very expensive neighborhood. They actually call it Manhattan because it's all like Manhattan, really. Ridiculous, I know. But, and in the Ottoman times, it was just like basically where the very rich pashas lived, and they were against the regime of the sultans most of the time, so they were revolutionary. It has this radical background too, but that's a long history. Anyway, so this is the sort of like the general field area, and my mom's office is right around here. So when I'm doing the field work that day, it's 30 degrees Celsius out, which is what, 90 Fahrenheit? Yeah, so it's burning. And I don't know how many of you have been to Istanbul. It's like moist, hot, and disgusting. Like, you don't want to be out in that weather walking around, but for the love of science. So this is where I am. I left the office, and this is where the bazaar is. That's where I'm going to go for that day. So I just took the shortcuts. There's a big hospital here, very crowded area. This is all very densely populated. I take this road in and I enter the bazaar right here. So, and this is a slope. There's a mosque right here. All of this is like really steep slopes. This is sort of like more even ground. So I turn right, basically, and I start walking down, and I am wearing pants, and they're like really long overalls on me. I have tattoos. So my intention was to cover the tattoos because this is a low-income, conservative neighborhood and you don't want to be too obvious. My leather bag was already too obvious in every sense, and my haircut telling them that I did not belong there, and everybody made it very obvious that I did not belong there. Yeah, they don't like foreigners that much. Even if you're Turkish, it's just like bad blood. And this is basically one of the strong castles of the current ruling conservative party, and I don't belong to that very clearly, so bad blood. So I'm walking down. I'm expecting this place is going to be filled with mothers, toddlers, children. Like everybody's supposed to be there, right? It's the middle of the day. They should be out, they should be shopping. Nobody. And I'm wondering what is going on here, because vendors are sort of setting their stuff up and their stalls and everything. And they see me, and obviously this person who's yeah, my body's covered, but there's a tattoo here and it shows. My hair's out in the open, I don't fit. They see this and sort of they attack that opportunity, and suddenly I see men grabbing the fruits and yelling at me. Hey, in Turkish it's abla, which means older sister. Abla gel gel, which means come over, come over. Look at these round, crisp, juicy fruits and vegetables, and the gaze, and I'm
what is going on here? Like, what am I in, why am I in this place? Because the overtones are so strong and so aggressive. At the same time, nobody's literally stepping a foot ahead, right? Like, nobody's making any harsh moves on me, but like, the fruits and vegetables are up in the air, and like, they're telling me to come over. They're telling me that if I don't like what they have, they're gonna stop vending, they're gonna leave the bazaar, and like, and I'm wondering, like, what is this testosterone in the air, or am I reading this wrong? So I feel very uncomfortable. I felt very, very uncomfortable. I decided to go back up, hoping that the other end of the bazaar is more settled, there will be more people, and I was right. I moved up, I turned back, I went all the way down, came all the way up, meanwhile feeling like walking in an alley of stairs, and I walked up, and it's more crowded. Lots of mothers with kids, they're on strollers, and I'm realizing, okay, this makes sense. These women don't want to carry the food and the babies at the same time because it's very heavy and the slopes are steep and it's hot, right? You don't want to do that, so you want to be as close to where you live, perhaps, as possible, like as close to the even ground as possible. It makes perfect sense. But then I'm thinking like, okay, this is good. Now I can do my research, take my pictures. I'm going to actually show you a bunch of pictures. I could not take pictures at that day, at that place, because of the stairs, which became the subject of the paper eventually. But then I have to mark from there. So I'm thinking like, okay, good. Now I can look around, I can take pictures, everything's fine now. Because all these women around, right? I can finally feel comfortable. No, more stairs, and this time it's like stronger and more vicious because they're like looking at me from like top down, and like this feeling of what is she doing here, like this person. And I'm trying to figure out. Then I realized something. They're like looking at me from top down, and like all the eyes suddenly stop at my feet, and I'm like, in Turkish we also have a saying, if somebody is your enemy, you look at their feet. And like literally looking at my feet, and I'm like, is this some weird idiom thing going on that I'm missing out? But no, I had dark nail polish, and apparently that's what the stairs were for. I realized that because when I look back at them, nobody had any nail polish, either in their hands or anywhere. So that's when I realized, okay, so this is a part of the conservative attire that I entirely missed out. But it gave me a good sort of like leeway into the spatial dynamics of the place and the gender dynamics of the place. Surveillance. The reason why I told you this story is in the bazaars, which are, as I said, one of the types of food exchange that I look at, surveillance through the gaze it's very common. In fact, it is one of the trademark characteristics of the bazaars that distinguish them from other sites of food exchange, such as the supermarkets, for example, where electronic surveillance and tracking devices dominate the site. So this is actually a trademark of the site. Nonetheless, the story that emphasizes the disciplinary function of the gaze, like other tools and techniques Foucault mentions, I'm a political theorist after all, the gaze or the gazes to others and to oneself has the capacity to make one conscious of one's body and behavior, as well as the presence of punitive mechanisms attached to the non-compliance and deviance. For the bazaar, the punitive mechanisms take various forms. On the one hand, there are agents of violence such as the state and the municipality police. On the other hand, there is the neighborhood or the community customers live in and have to rely on for various support networks. For example, all the way from the bodega guy who delivers the bread to the next door neighbor who can take care of the kids when there's an emergency. For the vendors, this takes the form of familial network they work with. At the threat of non-compliance, they may lose their jobs and their family, which can disintegrate. So it's a very real threat. Gazes also help produce the very norms that they help reinforce, right? Through the disciplinary apparatus. In the bazaar, the norm we can talk about, which I'm going to talk about, is the one that governs the relation between relations of production and relations of reproduction. It connotes male man, vendor, breadwinner on the one hand, and female woman, customer, homemaker, stay-home mom, housewife dichotomy. This is embedded into the bazaar through spatial arrangement, as I described before, and reinforced through the gaze. So I'm going to talk about the spatial arrangement a bit to give you an idea. There are two models. If the bazaar is in an enclosed space, this is the structure. The blue parts are vendors, and the rest of the spaces where like the customers can walk around. In this model, this is not the Keratani model. This is not in the bazaar that I showed you. It's the other one. I'm going to talk about that too. In this one, vendors are, this is also, if you're on the side, it's highlighted that you're using electricity, and there's a dynamic to that, but I'm not going to talk about it. That's for a different thing. Anyway, so usually the vendors that need, as I said, electricity, they're on the sides, and this setup increases the communication between vendors and customers, as well as between the vendors and between the customers. In the other model, and excuse my horrible paint drawings, I don't know how to use Photoshop. This is the other one. This is a street, basically. Imagine like a street crossing. All of these are vendors, so they're on the side, and customers walk in between. This is the Sanayi Mahallesi, the industrial neighborhood model that I talked about. Very uncomfortable. Vendors are on the side, customers are in the middle. This decreases the communication between vendors and customers, both within the groups and between the groups. And as I said, this is the model in Kağıthane, Sanayi Mahallesi. Hold on. So in both models, the demarcations between where vendors stand and where customers move are clearly visible. The gazes police the demarcations so that customers who are mostly female don't venture into male territory. Yet this is not only sex segregation in the bazaar space. The segregation also demarcates socioeconomic division of labor between the sexes. Females are women because they stay home, take care of the kids, buy the food to nourish the family, all womanly tasks of making sure that the family unit can reproduce itself. As such, by being customers, they become women, and as women, they are female. Their assigned space is the alley in between the vendors. Vendors, on the other hand, are behind the stalls, immobile for now. They are breadwinners for their families, and as such, they are men. As men, they are male because only males should be the breadwinners of their families. So this is the connection. The division is further embedded in the dynamics of mobility and stability. Vendors who are male seem stationary in the bazaar, but in fact, they move around the city with the bazaar every day. They can go anywhere in the city to set up their stalls. Mobility is their right as the males, as the men, and as the breadwinners. Women, in contrast, as customers, had to stick to the neighborhood. Not only transporting food over long distances across the city is difficult, and it doesn't make sense, especially with kids, but also it can raise too many eyebrows in the neighborhood, making them very uncomfortable. That's pretty much it. In conclusion, I want to say that my intention is not to paint the bazaars as hostile spaces neither for women nor for men, because they are not. This, however, does not mean that they are public spaces, free of tactics of domination or practices outside of power dynamics, and this is where I'm directly responding to Habermas. Contrary is the truth. They are public spaces in which, through spatial arrangements, surveillance, and division of labor, a specific articulation of the relation between relations of production and relations of reproduction are constructed and reproduced. Thus, bazaars cannot be considered outside of the capitalist relations. Their articulation to sex relations, gender norms, and performances, and the global political economy of food. They are not zones of liberation, revolt, or carnival, yet they might carry similar potentials. But just because they have potentials does not mean that these potentials are going to be realized. On the contrary, it can be true. They can actually reinforce the communitarian dynamics, which was often the case that I've seen. I'm going to stop here because I'm going to show this and I'm going to show the pictures. This is where I'm going with the rest of the project. Alienation, I'm planning to talk about supermarketization and alienation, urban transformation through the lens of neoliberalism. There's a crazy land grab thing going on in Istanbul right now through the various neoliberal policies that the government has been instituting. I'm sure you guys all have heard about the Gezi events last year. I was out in the street, literally, I landed and protests happened. I was out there. Now I'm writing a dissertation, actually. So all of this is connected in an interesting way, and bazaars, food spaces, food exchange sites have been part of it. This is from my sites. This is not about food, but this is the other side of it. Now, as again, like all the customers are female and all the vendors are male, and you get more interesting versions of this when they're actually selling lingerie. It gets pretty interesting. I can talk about that too. There's the child labor part of it. They are part of the male vendor, breadwinner dichotomy. Women also bring their kids, but they come as kids. They're actually part of the labor force. And lastly, the people who have urban gardens. That's the only time that you can see women in bazaars. Very rare. Or you can go to the upper class organic food stores and then you can see women as like these like things of progress or something. So there's this. She was the only one of actual producers that I could get a picture of. That I think in total of 17 bazaars that I've been to, and some of them are very large. I've seen about 2 or 3 women who were actually selling produce. So with this I conclude. Thank you.
Did we lose Abby? Oh, Abby, are you there?
I'm still here, but I can no longer see what's going on. I think your video turned off.
Oh, can you see now? I cannot do full screen.
Can
Can you hear?
I can hear, yeah, that's all I wrote.
Okay. I'm gonna do full screen then. It looks better. At the turn of the 20th century, organized crime in Chicago and across the U.S. revolved around 2 illicit economies, prostitution and gambling. In 1920, a third economy was open for business. This was the prohibition of the manufacturing, sale, and transportation of intoxicating beverages. In contrast to the sensationalized accounts of violent and glamorous mobsters, organized crime was mainly a day-to-day grind of informal, illicit, and behind-the-scenes work. Drivers, bouncers, saloon waitstaff, sex workers, managers, and couriers were foundational to organized crime activities. These low-wage positions resided at the boundaries of organized crime networks, and missing from much of the scholarship and histories of organized crime is that some of these positions included women. Shifting the examination from the center to the margins of organized crime networks reveals configurations of wives, girlfriends, sisters, mothers, daughters, and female neighbors and cousins who also contributed to organized crime. My dissertation draws on insights from illicit networks, social capital, feminist criminology, and sociology of gender to ask, how did relationships between men and women contribute to the structure of organized crime in early 1900 Chicago? In this dissertation, I employ the research methods of social network analysis and historical narrative to create the first relational database in existence that links women to early 1900s organized crime. To date, these networks contain over 3,000 individuals and 14,000 relationships between those individuals, and I'll explain more what I mean by that as I move through the talk. The paper that I'm using for the Advanced Feminist Certificate is the methods chapter of my dissertation. And in this chapter, I talk about relational approaches to locating women in the archives, the strengths and limitations of both of these methods, historical narrative and social network analysis, and then I discuss the process of creating a database that actually can locate women in organized crime. Today's theme is geography of power, so I was like, well, how do I fit into this theme? I think I found 2 ways. First, I'm going to talk about the archives as a location of power. And second, I'm going to talk about social networks as a social location of power and how inequalities exist within networks. So I study organized crime. This is a hidden population. For those of you familiar with quantitative research, we talk about hidden populations in terms of how we collect a sample. Not only do I have the hidden population of organized crime, I have a historical hidden population. So even if I found an informant, I couldn't ask that person or talk to that person or ask for references to interview more people. I also am studying women in a historical hidden population, and what we know from research on hidden populations, women tend to be underrepresented in hidden population research. So I have 3 strikes stacked against me, and I tried to overcome them all by using a really broad approach to the archives, trying to triangulate as many sources as possible, and looking in probably non-conventional spaces. My project, unfortunately, but perhaps practically, doesn't contain voices or personal diaries of women. I don't have oral histories with mobsters' wives. Instead, I'm really seeking out individuals and their activities and mapping out how they're connected to each other. So what I have here are a list of all the archives. Some of them are physical, some of them are online. And the total number of pages is actually the pages, not that I've read, but that I've coded to create a relational database.
archives are not neutral spaces, and I want to think about archives as a geography of power. Archives house the records of powerful families, churches, and states. Archives tend to privilege institutional histories over individual histories, and they tend to silence historically marginalized groups. When we think of archives as a geography of power, we can think about how they've diminished women's historical contributions over time. This has happened through the male-dominated national archiving efforts that have ignored women's historical contributions, by physically separating repositories of women's records, and women's own consideration of their personal writings as inconsequential and not worthy of storage. Feminist scholars have uncovered women's hidden and historical contributions in male-dominated activities for decades. Feminist scholars bring a critical lens to institutional archives in order to locate where women's experiences and contributions were intentionally or unintentionally buried. In addition to reading each record in their context, posing questions as to the origin and purpose of each document, feminist historians are required to ask what is happening between the lines of each document, what is happening in the silences of those documents, and also having to read for activity rather than voice. And this last point was particularly true for a study of organized crime. I had to find activities which included women rather than voices of women. Because of this, I bring in a second set of methodological tools to the historical narrative, and that's social network analysis. And I know some of you here are social scientists, so you're probably rolling your eyes like, oh my god, I'm so sick of social network analysis, because it's like really exploded in popularity. But I am going to do my really brief mini social network analysis lesson for you all. These are 4 individuals from my database. This is Victoria Moresco. She's a super, super important woman. This is Al Capone. If you go to the Chicago airport, you know about him. And the other 2 are also famous Chicago gangsters. A traditional statistical analysis is going to look at each individual and assign variables to those individuals. So in my data, I have place of birth, sometimes date of birth, place of death, marital status, number of children, occupation, right? So these are individual level variables. Feminist critiques have, feminists have critiqued individual level data in that they're only able to generate individual level explanations. And often as social scientists and as feminist scholars, we're interested in explanations of process, of inequality, of structure. And so this sort of individual variable-based approach isn't always getting at those questions that we're interested in. Social network scholars and relational thinkers actually share the exact same critique, that we need to move beyond the individual analysis to tackle the messier dynamic unfolding relations of the social world. So bring in to the individuals their relationships, and all of a sudden a structure begins to emerge. They're married and they co-own a brothel, they're cousins, they're gang members. If it wasn't for Victoria Moresco, Al Capone wouldn't have ended up in Chicago. I have to go a little bit more quickly. But there are structures involved, and my analysis lets me get at both of these. So what I do in my dissertation is create lots of these networks. As I mentioned before, I'm using archival sources. I built a relational database containing 3,000 individuals, each dot is an individual, and 14,000 relationships. I have over 100 types of relationships. I've really briefly explained some of them: marriage, criminal associates. I have relationships that are murders, pallbearers, if you gave someone an illegal political contribution or a legal political contribution. So I have hundreds of these categories, and I'm able to aggregate them into more meaningful networks, or like where some of them will make sense and some of them not. And what I'm able to do with these different types of relationships is zoom into parts of the network where women might be more prominent to locations where they're not. Right, so this is what I'm doing in the empirical chapters of my dissertation. One of the strengths of this is that I do have quite thin individual level data. I have some ethnic variables, some occupation variables, but what you see here is incredibly thick relational data revealing structures of organized crime. What do these networks mean? I think about networks as a resource. Located in these networks is an unequal access to that resource. Networks aren't a physical geography of power per se, but they are a social geography of power. What you see in this Prohibition network, this is 1920 to 1933, so these are the criminal relationships during Prohibition. Here I literally map out the relationships of the illicit economy of Prohibition. To be successful in this economy meant knowing which police officers took bribes, being close to an alderman who could protect you from raids, being connected to the fixers who are connected to the judges, right? So being here, you're not probably very successful, but you might not get arrested. Being around here, you're probably getting arrested or being interrogated by the IRS. But being around here where you have this sort of access to the resources in this network might reveal something about like where these positions of more access and more success reside. In the historical chapters of my dissertation, I can also calculate dozens and dozens of statistics generated from only network position. So I don't have, like I said, I don't have a lot of outcome variables, but I can say women, have this degree where men have this degree, and I can find these positions of inequality and positions of more gender equity than we might expect. This, I just really like these pictures, so I'm just gonna, as I'm transitioning to my larger theoretical argument, I'll just show you better pictures, even though they don't really make sense for what I'm gonna say. The broad goal of my dissertation is to contribute a theory of gendered social capital, specifically gendered criminal capital. I'm specifically interested in explaining the sex differences in offending. Sex differences in offending are the largest discrepancy in offending. Women make up 25% of all arrests, men make up 75% of all arrests. Women make up 9% of all incarcerated persons, men make up 91% of all incarcerated persons. And feminist criminology and criminology at large has done a really poor theoretical job of explaining this sex difference. They've been really stuck in sort of socialization of gender arguments or gender differences in social control arguments. There's a small literature on co-offending which shows that men influence women's offending, but women have no influence on men's offending. So I'm really interested in sort of bringing these all together to understand the sex gap in offending, and of course I look at it as a social network. I understand the sex discrepancy in offending through the context of networks. Networks, whether criminal or legitimate, private or public, contain resources. Access to those resources requires particular constellations of relationships, and particular positions in a social network have unequal access. This is true for getting a job, getting a promotion, or committing a crime. By being attentive to this category of men and women, but situating that category within a larger structure of relationships, for me, criminal and non-criminal relationships, I think we will be able to locate, interrogate, and explain sex gaps in offending, in legitimate spheres, in workplaces. Thank you.
Okay, so our two discussants are Victoria and Brittany.
Yep.
I don't know what order you want
I'll try to get Abby back. Abby, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, time for discussion.
Oh, great. I can only hear people if they're really close to the mic, just heads up.
Okay, we'll have the discussants come up here.
And I can't see anybody.
Oh, maybe we can turn it
Yay, the video came back.
The color is so wrong on this, so wrong on this.
It's up to you, whatever you want.
It's on the wall that I came up with.
Great
Mark,
color.
on the wall that came up.
So this like dark orange and dark teal.
What is that?
Come out so good. Like,
Sí,
one
gracias.
project, oh, it looks like barf.
Use a microphone.
Okay, actually, some of my questions were answered in the presentations today, so I'll just kind of start with my overview and I'll work my way through the questions. They might just kind of be a little redundant at this point. So this panel, Geographies of Power, certainly takes us around the world from right next door in Franklin County, Massachusetts to Istanbul, Turkey. However, 3 of the 4 papers focus on a U.S. experience of power and powerlessness, and one on the shifting urban landscape of Istanbul. On the other hand, 3 of the 4 papers, including Hanan Turkin's study of the bazaar in Istanbul, engage with live subjects rather than archival subjects, presenting far different research challenges than the processes described in Chris Smith's archival study of women and organized crime networks in early 1900s Chicago. And finally, 3 of the 4 specifically take women as their subjects. The Abby Templar's project uses feminist theory combined with social theory to test the empowerment of a group marginalized collectively by profession rather than individual gender identification. The range of research questions, subjects, locations, and historical context showcase different configurations of power, powerlessness, empowerment, and the related identity processes that enable and limit an individual's movement through the world, both big and small. In the ensuing discussion, these cultural, social, and historical differences demand consideration. First, however, some common themes. Each of these papers combines selections from social theory with feminist theory, and I generalize here, but mostly Foucauldian theories of power and a feminist theory of intersectionality, to balance out the methodological strengths and weaknesses of each, and to question the construction of power and power relations that marginalize, separate, and construct certain social groups or social actors in relation to another. Sarah Miller interviews 50 young college women, ages 18 to 20, to show how rumor and bullying are ways for American teenagers to construct and demarcate their identities around the parameters of what is perceived to be normative heterosexual femininity. Chris Smith organized a considerable amount of found archival data to raise questions about women participants and female entanglement in the Al Capone organized crime network. Abby Templar's research tested the productive aspects of scientific research combined with peer interactions to pursue the possibilities of empowering an economically marginalized community, namely the artists, in Franklin County, Massachusetts. And Cannon Turkin's field research identified female spaces and behaviors in relation to men at the bazaar in Istanbul, considering the ways in which the, quote, the conditions of reproduction got reproduced, end quote, through the division of labor, observed the marketplace, which specifically functions as a socioeconomic site that models larger macro-level apparatuses. So the projects employed a variety of methods to sample as diverse a group as possible, or to diversify the results for a broader picture of the issue at hand. This included snowball sampling, various advertising methods, both online and offline, to attract broad sample groups, and Kenan Turkin's observation of different markets in and around, or in Istanbul, they were all in Istanbul, okay, in Istanbul, urban Turkey. Abby explains that her research group loosely mirrored the demographics of Franklin County in race and gender, but were unable to even out the representations of age and class within the sample group. And while Chris acknowledges the limits of accessing female subjects through archival material about male subjects, one of the most compelling aspects of Chris's research is the organization of data to list female participation and entanglement, both professionally and socially, albeit in relation to these male participants, of the Al Capone organized crime network. I'm not sure I understand the archive either, and I would like to actually hear more about it. The one that you have, not the archives you worked in, but this archive
the
data.
database. Yeah.
The database, okay. But with digital databases and the opportunities they offer with nonlinear keyword searches and related search angles through hyperlinking, it seems that the preliminary groundwork that you've done opens up endless opportunities for future research. So Sarah Miller also reached out to a broader sample group, and though all interview subjects were admittedly college students, they came from a variety of secondary education institutions, which generated a diverse sample group in race, class, and sexual orientation. Camden Turkin's paper focuses on bazaars in Istanbul, so we are presented largely with research collected from urban markets in Turkey, though Turkin observes demographic differences and mostly class difference within neighborhoods, markets, and places within the markets. So for each of the papers, I decided to pose one question, but as I said, for some of these, my questions were answered in the presentations, which were a little bit different from the papers. So Sarah, you mentioned that this really got cleared up, so I'm going to skip this one. The rumor, gossip, and bullying were 3 terms that you kind of used interchangeably in the paper, and I was wondering if there's if they're to be understood as synonyms, especially the rumor and the gossip. or do they function differently for the construction and limitation then of identity? And maybe can you explain why you chose the age group 18 to 20, which is still arguably pretty young? I'd have to look it up, but I recently read an article of a study in England about bullying, and it was that 40 years later, there is still a lot of psychological trauma that people are dealing with, and so I'd be interested to know why you chose this very rather young age group. And on your PowerPoint, you wrote not psychological context, so I was wondering why you choose then not to engage then with research or this context on psychology. Chris used was just first of all a very quick clarification. In your paper, you kept referring to we in your research, and it was never clear to me who the we is. So maybe that would get to your research process, I guess. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit. My question was more about the what's at stake question in yours, but I think your PowerPoint really, your end of your PowerPoint really got to that. So I'm sorry, I don't have another question for you. And Abby, your paper clearly shows how the research project, by shifting the focus to individual assets over need-based thinking, was able to open up new creative and economic opportunities. However, the needs-based approach that your project specifically counters is shaped by very real financial considerations in a lot of communities. So even though the artist's average income is lower than the average income for a worker in the district, as you show in your paper, to what extent is the ability to turn the focus away from the economic or material issues coming already from a position of privilege? And I guess this is kind of getting at this argument of the